Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world where the nights were long, the streets were questionable, and most people saw things they couldn't quite explain, mostly because science was still taking a very long nap. So go ahead and settle in, dim the lights, let the modern world melt away, and let's wander slowly, sleepily into the medieval imagination. A place where a comet was a divine message, a two-headed calf was definitely the end times, and the local noble was probably doing something deeply odd in his private chamber. Because of course he was. Let's drift into our first strangely medieval site. A calm meander through about 15 things the average person could encounter that would make us blink twice today. But back then were met with a sigh, a prayer, and maybe a mild panic attack. 1. Comets. Naturally misunderstood on arrival, medieval people adored a good celestial omen. Not in a fun look, a shooting star way, but more in a whelp, someone important is going to die and we're all doomed tone. When Halley's Comet appeared in 1066, people reacted exactly as you'd expect, by assuming it was the universe's version of a strongly worded letter. Kings trembled, peasants trembled, probably the cattle trembled a bit too. The irony, of course, is that while modern astronomers admire its elegant arc, medieval chroniclers described comets like they were flaming swords of cosmic disapproval, which, to be fair, is a pretty metal interpretation, just not very calming at the time. 2. Saints' relics that were suspiciously abundant. Let's just drift gently into one of the more profitable medieval industries, religious relics. If you ever wondered how many fingers St. John the Baptist had, the answer, according to medieval Europe, was approximately 27 at least. The man was spiritually generous. Relics were everywhere. A splinter from the true cross here, a vial of the Virgin Mary's milk there, tooth of a saint, cloak of a saint, the saint's cousin's horse's saddle strap. Pilgrims traveled days to see them. Nobles guarded them like treasure. And somewhere, quietly, someone in a workshop was probably thinking, yes, this looks reasonably holy. Naturally, no one asked follow-up questions. Medieval life was much more soothing when you accepted things at face value. 3. Processions of flagellants calmly beating themselves during plagues and disasters. Groups of men shirtless, barefoot, and very dramatic would march slowly through towns while whipping themselves. Today, that would prompt a wellness check. In the Middle Ages, people simply nodded, whispered a prayer, and hoped the flagellants didn't accidentally drip spiritual intensity on their doorstep. They believed the self-inflicted punishment could soothe divine wrath. It did not, but it was certainly a sight. 4. Animals put on trial for crimes. Medieval courts were thorough, perhaps too thorough. If a pig trampled a child, or a rooster laid an egg, a deeply suspicious event, the animal could be put on trial, with a lawyer and witnesses, and sometimes even assigned a little outfit for court decorum. Yes, really. There's something wonderfully sleepy about imagining a courtroom where a goat sits across from a solemn judge, while everyone pretends this is a normal Tuesday. Punishments varied. Some animals were fined, some were excommunicated, because naturally, banning a pig from the church was the obvious move. 5. Medieval medicine, mostly guesswork and robes. If you were ill, the medieval physician's toolkit included leeches, astrology, and vague confidence. A doctor might peer at the sky, glance at your urine, hold your wrist thoughtfully, and then announce something like, "Your humors are misaligned." They usually were. People saw green-robed physicians carrying jars of teeth, knives of questionable sharpness, and books full of very serious diagrams that often had no relation to human anatomy. It was all very official, very scholarly, and very ineffective, but soothing, perhaps, in the sense that at least someone was trying. 6. Nobles wearing colors so bright they probably glowed. We tend to picture medieval people in sad brown tunics, but nobles loved colors, violently bright colors. A count might stroll through town looking like a human peacock crossed with a carnival tent. Purples, golds, saturated green shades intense enough to keep you awake at night. The average villager, who owned maybe one faded garment, would see these shimmering figures glide past like walking lanterns of wealth and questionable taste. It was all very impressive, and mildly obnoxious. 7. The medieval equivalent of influencers. Wandering preachers with intensity issues. Picture a man with wild hair, a robe that had definitely seen things, and a voice already warmed up for a full afternoon of prophecy. These preachers wandered from village to village, announcing the end of days with the energy of someone who'd had too much honey wine. People gathered around. Some listened, some hid. It wasn't exactly entertainment. But when your other options were spinning wool or staring at a wall, the dramatic doomsayer was a welcome break. 8. Festivals where people reversed all social order once a year. Peasants could elect a mock bishop or a mock king, the so-called Feast of Fools. This replacement ruler would wear ridiculous clothing, shout commands, and lead a procession of people behaving like the medieval version of a student improv group. Church officials hated it. Naturally, that made everyone else love it even more. For one day, chaos replaced hierarchy. Then, the next morning, people returned to chores and taxes as if nothing odd had happened. 9. Knights fighting snails in manuscripts. Medieval scribes decorated manuscripts with tiny drawings doodles, really of knights battling giant snails. Why? No one actually knows. Maybe the snail symbolized sin. Maybe it symbolized the slow decay of life. Or maybe the scribes were simply bored from copying Latin for 14 hours a day. Whatever the reason, medieval readers saw armored men solemnly dueling aggressive gastropods and apparently just accepted it. 10. A hermit living on a pillar for 30 years. Some holy men believed the best way to get closer to God was to climb onto a stone pillar and stay there. For decades, people visited these column dwellers like they were spiritual tourist attractions. The hermit would pray, preach, and occasionally pull up food in a basket. Meanwhile, visitors would look up and think, well, that's certainly dedication, or something. It was considered deeply admirable, though one imagines the hermits grew very tired of birds. 11. Banquets with foods shaped like other foods. Medieval elites enjoyed subtleties, elaborate creations designed more to confuse than feed. A meat dish shaped like a castle, bread shaped like a swan, a pie that, when cut open, released live birds. Yes, the medieval surprise pie was very real. Guests would gasp politely, pretending this was completely reasonable behavior in a dining hall. 12. Cats being accused of witchcraft. Cats had a difficult time in certain centuries. Some people believed they carried demonic energy. Seeing a black cat wander through a village might trigger a small crowd of people making hand gestures and muttering prayers. Ironically, eliminating cats helped rats thrive, which helped plague spread. Naturally, nobody realized this. The Middle Ages were an ongoing lesson in unintended consequences. 13. Knights who looked far less majestic than their portraits. If you imagine a knight as a towering, sculpted warrior hero, please set that image down gently beside you. Many knights were short, round, and exhausted. Armor was heavy. Horses were small. Some knights waddled more than marched. Some toppled over. Some had to be lifted onto their mounts by assistants who probably had very strong opinions about their employers. Yet artists painted them as statuesque figures of chivalry. Artistic honesty was not a priority. 14. People bathing together like it was the most normal thing in the world. Medieval bathhouses were lively social centers. Men and women bathed together. Food and drinks were often served. It was all very cozy, if slightly steamy and chaotic. Priests objected, of course, which meant many bathhouses remained very popular. Eventually, fear of disease and moral panic shut most of them down. But for a time, medieval people enjoyed spa days that would surprise many modern visitors. 15. Traveling doctors with bags of oddities. Some healers wandered the countryside with bags full of powders, dried plants, stones, charms, and occasionally items that probably shouldn't have been inside a medical bag. They were the medieval equivalent of portable wellness gurus. They'd set up in a town square, announce cures for everything from gout to heartbreak, and distribute potions that likely tasted like wet disappointment. People watched with fascination, half skeptical and half hopeful. Because when life is hard, you don't question the man with the mysterious bottle labeled elixir. And gently, that brings us to the end of part 1. A soft, meandering stroll through some of the strangest things medieval people accepted with admirable calm. Hey everyone, let's drift a little deeper now. We're leaving behind the bustling medieval streets and wandering quietly into the candlelit halls of castles, manor houses, and drafty royal chambers where nobles lived their very complicated lives. It's a softer world here, stone walls, echoing footsteps, tapestries that look impressive until you notice they're mostly just lions doing oddly human things. And inside these great halls lived people who believed themselves chosen by God, while often behaving like sleep-deprived toddlers with crowns. So settle in again, let your shoulders sink a little. We're going to wander through the strange habits, fragile family lines, and quietly chaotic personal lives of medieval nobles. Because if you've ever felt like your life is messy, well, medieval aristocrats would like to offer you some competition. Let's drift gently into our first noble household. 1. A lifestyle built entirely on drafts, tapestries, and very cold stone floors. Castles sound glamorous, but if you actually lived in one, your main experience would have been cold. They were essentially enormous stone refrigerators. Charming, yes. Architecturally impressive, certainly, but still refrigerators. Nobles walked around wrapped in cloaks, furs, and layers of wool, shuffling like medieval burritos trying to stay warm. Tapestries on the walls weren't decorative so much as insulation attempts to persuade the wind not to whistle through the hall at 2 in the morning. Servants lit fires in every possible hearth, though the smoke often drifted into rooms instead of up chimneys, leaving everyone pleasantly marinated in the aroma of medieval campfire. It's little wonder nobles aged early. Nothing says regal dignity like ruling your lands while shivering slightly. 2. The noble diet. Meat, occasional vegetable. More meat. A noble feast was impressive to behold. Silver platters, steaming dishes, and servants carrying delicacies with the solemnity of people afraid of being yelled at. But the diet itself, heavy, very heavy. A noble might begin the day with bread soaked in wine. Lunch might include roast birds, stews, pastries, and perhaps a token vegetable that had been boiled into near oblivion. Dinner was just lunch, but with more animals involved. Vegetables were considered food for peasants, because of course they were. The result was that nobles often suffered from gout, indigestion, and general noble discomfort. Chroniclers loved to note how lords limped heroically into councils, struggling with swollen joints from diets that modern doctors would consider personal attacks. Still, no feast was complete without at least one questionable culinary stunt, like a roasted boar whose mouth was stuffed with a smaller roasted animal, which contained an even smaller one, a sort of medieval meat matryoshka doll. 3. Fragile bloodlines held together with hope and a concerning amount of cousin marriage. Ah yes, noble family trousseaux, elegant genealogical diagrams that, when examined closely, resembled pretzels. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was about alliances, land, and occasionally the faint hope of producing an heir who wouldn't tea-faint at the sight of sunlight. Some dynasties suffered from so much inbreeding that their genetic health became something of a cosmic joke. There were princes who were described as gentle, which was often medieval shorthand for couldn't manage stairs without supervision. Others were sickly, frail, or possessed jawlines that extended just slightly too far, thanks to generations of cousins saying sure, why not? Yet nobles regarded these arrangements as perfectly logical. Why marry someone unrelated when you could marry someone who was already present at family dinners? Naturally, this didn't end well for many dynasties, but it did keep court physicians employed. 4. Court physicians who carried knives with confident uncertainty. Speaking of physicians, a noble had access to the best medical expertise the Middle Ages could offer, which, tragically, still wasn't very good. Doctors prescribed warm baths for cold illnesses, cold baths for warm illnesses, and occasionally a nice bleeding when they weren't sure. A noble with a fever might be subjected to herbal brews, heated stones, and helpful suggestions like, perhaps you should not anger God. These physicians carried instruments that looked more like tools for carpentry than medicine, and often treated noble children with potions containing ingredients such as crushed pearls, powdered gold, or dried flowers that served more symbolic purpose than medicinal. Still, nobles trusted them, because when your other option was asking the village wise woman who brewed cures in a pot over a fire, the man in the velvet robe seemed slightly more official. 5. Noble children, tiny adults with heavy responsibilities and even heavier clothing. If you picture medieval children running joyfully through palace halls, that image is optimistic. Noble children were raised more like future diplomatic investments than actual children. Little boys were dressed in miniature versions of adult outfits. Little girls were wrapped in gowns and veils, so long they could trip over them at any moment. A 6-year-old noble might already be learning to read Latin, practice etiquette, or recite the genealogies of 12 allied houses. Some were betrothed before they could form complete sentences. Childhood was short, expectations were high, and the clothing was always itchy. 6. The noble bedroom, where drafts, straw beds, and nightgowns met royal bedrooms, sound luxurious. But comfort wasn't quite the priority we imagine. Beds were large but stuffed with straw or wool. Mattresses sagged. Sheets might be changed seasonally if one was particularly lucky. Nobles slept in layered nightclothes and fur-lined caps to keep out the cold. Servants sometimes slept on the floor near both for safety, and because nobles frequently needed someone to refill the fire, fetch water, or chase away rodents with medieval enthusiasm. Privacy was a luxury. Most nobles lived surrounded by attendants, advisors, servants, and relatives who simply refused to go home. A quiet night was rare. A warm night was rarer, but it was still considered the height of prestige. 7. The strange extent of noble superstitions. Nobles had education, lands, armies, and absolutely unshakable belief in omens. If a bird flew into a hall, it was a message. If a mirror cracked, people whispered. If the household cat sneezed 3 times, someone probably consulted an astrologer. Astrologers held immense influence. Kings scheduled battles around planetary alignments. Queens chose wedding dates with advice from men who confidently charted futures using star maps and vague hand gestures. A noble's daily schedule could be rearranged entirely because Mars was feeling uncooperative. It was all very serious and deeply inefficient. 8. Courtly love. Elaborate romantic theater with no practical purpose. Medieval nobles invented a type of love that sounds poetic in theory and exhausting in practice. A knight would adore a lady he could never actually marry. He'd write poems in her honor. She'd smile politely and pretend to appreciate them. Everyone would sigh dramatically. This system produced a lot of longing, a lot of poetry, and almost no actual relationships. If you ever feel like modern dating is confusing, rest assured, courtly love was worse and more full of lace. 9. Noble hobbies. Falconry, chess, harps, and mildly dangerous outdoor activities. Nobles had a surprising amount of free time, which they filled in creative ways. Falconry was a favorite. Nothing says I am wealthy like walking around with a bird that wants to escape you at all times. Hunting was popular too. Entire forests were reserved for noble sport, which peasants were banned from entering, unless they wished to experience noble justice in the form of fines or, occasionally, arrows. Indoors, nobles played chess, lute music, and occasionally told long stories that somehow lasted several evenings. Entertainment options were limited, but nobles made the most of them. 10. Marriages arranged with more politics than affection. A noble marriage wasn't about compatibility. It was about alliances, land, and producing heirs who were hopefully less sickly than their parents. A noble might meet their future spouse for the first time on their wedding day, glance politely, and think, well, I suppose this is happening. Weddings were formal, political, and often slightly awkward, but they cemented alliances and occasionally produced couples who actually learned to like each other once the paperwork settled. Of course, some didn't. Medieval nobles were quietly excellent at holding lifelong grudges. 11. Noble meltdowns. Quietly recorded by chroniclers with outstanding restraint, kings and queens were human, which meant they had emotional moments. Chroniclers were usually instructed to record these moments carefully, which means we have delightful accounts such as, "The king grew wroth and departed swiftly. The queen expressed displeasure in a manner most audible. The duke did cast his goblet to the floor in mild agitation." These polite phrases translate roughly to royal tantrums. One king locked himself in his room for 2 days after losing an argument. Another ripped off his crown, threw it across the hall, and demanded it be replaced properly this time. Medieval nobility were, in short, dramatic in the calmest possible ways. 12. Wardrobe choices that could start family arguments. Noble clothing was a serious matter. Colors signaled rank, patterns signaled alliances, and sometimes an outfit was simply an opportunity to show off how much fabric one could afford. Long sleeves that dragged on the floor were fashionable for a while, forcing noble women to gather them up like exhausted bridesmaids. One queen wore sleeves so wide she could probably have stored small pets inside them. It was considered elegant. There were also pointed shoes, so long they required laces to tie them to the legs. Walking became more of a polite shuffle, but the fashion endured, and nobles would have defended these choices with all the conviction of people absolutely convinced that looking slightly ridiculous was a form of power. 13. Court gossip. the lifeblood of the aristocracy. With limited entertainment and close quarters, nobles turned to gossip with remarkable dedication. Who was secretly feuding? Who was quietly plotting? Who had said something mildly insulting years ago and never apologized? Court gossip drifted through halls like smoke, weaving itself into relationships and influencing decisions in ways that would make modern office politics look gentle. Some nobles thrived on it, others were undone by it, but nobody escaped it. 14. The noble library, filled with books that few could actually read. Books were expensive, painstakingly copied, highly treasured, so nobles owned them, lots of them, even if many nobles couldn't read Latin or sometimes couldn't read much at all. The collection was a status symbol, a wall of knowledge they could gesture toward proudly, while privately hoping no one asked them to interpret any of it. It's rather comforting, in a way. Medieval nobles invented decorative bookshelves centuries before they became a modern interior design trend. 15. A daily routine built on ceremony, ritual, and mild inconvenience. A noble's day unfolded slowly, wrapped in ritual. Waking was a ceremony. Dressing required attendance. Meals involved toasts, prayers, and sometimes long speeches from people nobody had invited to speak. Nothing was quick. Everything had meaning, and a noble might spend an entire morning preparing for lunch. There's something strangely soothing about that. A life lived at the pace of candles burning and servants bustling. A life full of pomp, minor discomforts, and an endless stream of quiet, peculiar habits. Hey everyone, let's drift even deeper. Now past the nobles in their cold stone halls, past the wandering preachers and drafty towers, and into the very center of medieval power, into the uppermost tier of society, where the royalty lived, a place where the clothing was brighter, the food richer, and the mistakes significantly louder, yet still carried out with the soft, unquestionable dignity of divine right. So settle a bit more, maybe pull a blanket up. We're floating now into the chambers of kings and queens, whose lives were somehow grand, strange, and quietly tragic all at once. Because medieval monarchs weren't just rulers, they were symbols allegedly chosen by heaven, but often undone by genetics, bad decisions, and a tendency toward melodrama that would make modern actors blush. Let's drift gently into their world. 1. Royal births. Already political before the baby even cried, a royal birth wasn't a private moment. It was a public event with enough witnesses to qualify as an early form of reality television. Queens often gave birth in rooms filled with ladies in waiting, midwives, servants, and depending on the realm, nobles who wanted to confirm the heir was in fact an heir and not a conveniently substituted bundle. Privacy was suspicious, noise was expected, confusion was guaranteed. People believed that the future of the kingdom depended on the infant's very first breath. A frail cry could spark rumors within minutes. A loud cry could be interpreted as a promising start, unless the local astrologer claimed the stars were unhappy that day, in which case, back to uncertainty. And so, from the very first moment, a royal child already carried the weight of the world, wrapped in linen and political expectation. 2. Royal education, Latin etiquette, and absolutely no practical skills. Royal children were trained by scholars. They learned Latin before they learned how to play. They memorized genealogies stretching back into legendary nonsense. They practiced posing in ways that looked regal and bored. What they did not learn, how to do anything remotely practical. A prince might be instructed in riding, falconry, and battlefield strategy, all useful in theory, but he probably couldn't cook an egg or fetch his own cloak without alarming everyone around him. A princess might be trained in diplomacy, music, and flawless embroidery, all while being subtly prepared to marry a cousin from another kingdom to strengthen alliances. Royal childhood was less about growing and more about grooming, ensuring the child could become either a monarch or a bargaining tool with impressive table manners. 3. The royal wardrobe, a soft parade of fabrics, jewels, and hidden discomforts. If a royal noble's clothing was extravagant, a monarch's wardrobe was essentially an ongoing performance of wealth. Kings wore velvets and satins, queens wore brocades, heavy enough to count as light exercise. Crowns looked impressive, but were generally painful. Not in a dramatic way, more in a mild but persistent headache that lasts throughout the state dinner way. Royal shoes were beautiful but stiff. Royal cloaks were long and dignified, but also deeply impractical in windy weather. And everything jingled. Royal garments were decorated with bells, jewels, clasps, embroidery, and metal fittings that made gentle clinking noises with every step. It created the subtle impression that the monarch was both majestic and carrying an entire portable jewelry store. 4. The royal court, a constant swirl of compliments, politics, and people pretending to like each other. Royal courts were busy, but not with anything obvious. People stood around, ate small delicacies, whispered gossip, offered compliments that bordered on flattery so exaggerated it was practically performance art. A courtier might say something like, "Your Majesty's wisdom is brighter than all the stars combined," to which the king would nod modestly, pretending this was not an absurd claim. Every gesture carried weight. Who sat where? Who was invited to speak? Who accidentally tripped on a rush mat and instantly became the focus of 2 weeks of court whispers? The court was a delicate ecosystem, equal parts elegant and exhausting. And for royals, navigating it required stamina, politeness, and the ability to endure conversations with people who had extremely ambitious agendas. 5. Royal meals, feasts that could impress or induce regret. A royal meal was less about eating and more about spectacle. Tables overflowing with meats, pastries, sauces, fruits, and dishes shaped into unlikely forms. Swan served on platters, its feathers removed, roasted, and then placed back on the bird for visual flair. A visual flair no one particularly asked for. Live musicians played softly, servants hurried, people engaged in dignified conversation while trying to cut their food quietly with knives that were not always sharp enough for the job. And always, at least one dish contained far too much spice added, purely to show that the royal household had money to spend on rare imports. Afterward, kings often experienced indigestion, queens often sighed politely at the chaos, and everyone else prayed the next feast would involve fewer creative culinary experiments. 6. Royals and their pets, a menagerie of questionable choices. Kings and queens adored unusual pets. Some kept small dogs, others kept falcons, a few kept lions, leopards, and other animals that caused their castle staff unnecessary stress. One king received a polar bear as a diplomatic gift. It lived in a moat, which seems both innovative and deeply impractical. Another monarch kept a collection of monkeys which regularly escaped and caused minor indoor chaos, overturning inkpots, stealing food, and occasionally biting courtiers who definitely did not want to admit they're deep bitten by the king's favorite pet. Yet royals loved these animals dearly. In a life full of ceremony, pets were one of the few genuinely comforting things they could enjoy without political consequence. Unless the pet escaped, then it was political and embarrassing. 7. Illness in the palace, a quiet panic wrapped in silk robes when a royal caught a cold. It was an event. When a royal caught anything worse, it became history. Doctors were summoned, priests were summoned, letters were dispatched with the urgency of people pretending not to be alarmed, and the palace would slip into a heavy hush. Courtiers whispered, servants prayed, astrologers pointed at the sky and said things that were both vague and unhelpful. Royal illnesses were viewed as omens for the entire realm. If the king's fever worsened, nobles reconsidered alliances. If it improved, feasts were prepared. It was all very dramatic, but very quietly dramatic. The kind of atmosphere where no one raises their voice, yet everyone looks worried at the same time. 8. Fragile monarchs, a common medieval theme. Medieval genetics were unkind, especially to families who preferred to keep marriage circles extremely limited. Some kings were described as intelligent, but fragile, meaning they spent much of their lives indoors, protected from drafts and stress. Others were described as gentle, which often meant sickly. A few were described as simple, which chroniclers wrote very carefully to avoid offending anyone. There were kings who fainted easily, queens who were chronically ill, princes who struggled with mobility, speech, or general health in ways that made ruling challenging. And yet these individuals still ascended thrones, guided by advisors who may or may not have had the kingdom's best interests in mind. Royal fragility was both a political vulnerability and a well-kept family secret. 9. The royal bedroom, more symbolic than romantic. Royal couples did not spend much time together. They had separate chambers, separate schedules, separate attendants. Their nights together were often arranged for political or reproductive reasons, and witnessed not visually, but ceremonially by servants to confirm things happened as expected. Nothing kills romance quite like an audience waiting in the hallway. After heirs were produced, The royal couple often drifted into lives of polite distance, separate hobbies, separate courts, separate interpretations of marriage. Some pairs grew fond of each other over time, others tolerated each other, and a few maintained the kind of formal frostiness that chroniclers politely described as distinct cordiality. 10. Kings with tempers, queens with patience. Medieval kings were not known for emotional restraint. Some shouted, some sulked, some stormed through halls in moods so severe that servants hid behind tapestries. Queens, meanwhile, cultivated the art of quiet endurance. They smiled, they waited, they practiced diplomacy as naturally as breathing. Their power was subtle, woven into relationships, alliances, and patience, the kind of patience needed to manage a court, raise heirs, and prevent political disaster caused by their husband yelling at the wrong noble. Chroniclers often recorded the king's actions, but it was the queen who maintained the balance, a quiet force in a world of loud authority. 11. Coronations. Beautiful ceremonies with underlying anxiety. A coronation was a spectacle of incense, music, and the solemn weight of crowns. But underneath the grandeur was a quiet tension. People watched closely. Did the crown fit properly? Did the king wobble? Did the queen look radiant or exhausted? Tiny signs were interpreted as omens. A candle flickering at the wrong moment could cause murmurs. A bird flying overhead could spark prophecies. Still, coronations were hopeful moments full of promise that the new monarch would bring peace, prosperity, or at least fewer arguments than the previous one. 12. Royal advisors. People who smiled politely while plotting. Every royal had advisors. Some wise, some ambitious, some who only looked wise because they had impressive beards. Advisors influenced decisions behind velvet curtains. They whispered about rivals. They suggested alliances. They occasionally nudged the king in directions that benefited themselves far more than the realm. If a royal made a terrible choice, such as starting a war or marrying the wrong person, advisors often reassured them it was brilliant, and kings believed them, because kings were educated, but not always sensible. 13. Gift-giving. The royal tradition of receiving things nobody asked for. Diplomatic gifts were common, but not always practical. Monarchs received live animals, embroidered garments in questionable colors, religious relics, furniture too heavy to move, and occasionally items so obscure that even the giver couldn't explain them well. Accepting the gift required ceremony. Displaying it required space. Appreciating it required imagination. And so, royal storage rooms slowly filled with objects that made visitors quietly raise their eyebrows. 14. Royal travel. A slow, fancy migration of people, horses, and luggage. When a king traveled, he did not travel lightly. Hundreds of attendants followed, carts full of supplies, tents, furniture, chests of clothing, more chests of clothing, and an entire kitchen staff. Villagers prepared for weeks. Nobles scrambled. Servants panicked over logistics, and the king himself sat in a litter or on horseback, drifting slowly through the countryside like a moving festival of responsibility. It was exhausting, but impressive, and deeply inconvenient for everyone involved. 15. The weight of the crown, heavy in all the quiet ways. Kings and queens lived lives wrapped in silk, power, and ceremony, but they also lived in cages made of expectation. Every action mattered, every word carried risk, every illness sparked fear, every relationship influenced politics. Royal life was beautiful from a distance, and quietly burdensome up close. Their world was one of drafty halls, dazzling garments, fragile health, political tension, and constant watchfulness. A life of luxury woven through with strain. And so, as we drift out of this chapter, we leave behind monarchs who looked magnificent in portraits, but often lived in a state of gentle, continuous stress. Let's drift gently back into the medieval world, a place where certainty was rare, hygiene was optional, and everyone was just sort of hoping their neighbor didn't turn out to be a witch. The nights were dark, the winters were long, and the bar for strange was surprisingly low. Yet somehow, medieval Europe still managed to produce sights so baffling, so spectacularly odd, that even people who thought comets were divine tantrums had to stop and say, well, that's new. So, let's quietly wander onward. 11. Monks who lived on top of pillars. For some reason, one of the stranger spectacles involved holy men who decided that life on the ground was simply too noisy, or too sinful, or perhaps it just didn't offer the same breeze. These were the stylites monks who spent years, and sometimes decades, living on top of tall stone pillars. Yes, pillars, straight up, like pigeons, except far more riches to medieval villagers wandering by. It must have been an unsettling combination of awe and mild confusion. You look up and there's a man, possibly quite sweaty, muttering prayers 40 feet in the air. And of course, the pilgrims came. They always came. Some brought gifts, others brought questions. Some simply wanted to stare at the monk like he was the medieval equivalent of a roadside oddity. Meanwhile, the poor man on the pillar just tried to stay focused, while also hoping it wouldn't rain. It was considered holy, admirable, and deeply inspiring. But one suspects the villagers went home thinking, well, whatever helps him sleep at night. 12. The medieval hair shirt. Fashion moment. If you've ever had a sweater made of wool that felt a little too scratchy, congratulations, you've already survived the mild, civilized version of medieval self-torture fashion. Medieval people fully believed that the best way to become spiritually pure was to suffer constantly. So some wore hair shirts, clothing made of coarse, itchy animal hair, designed to inflict continuous discomfort. Kind of like a medieval version of skinny jeans, except with far worse chafing and fewer compliments. Seeing someone walking around in one of these was a sight. They would wince with every movement. They would sweat miserably in the summer. Their entire existence conveyed the energy of someone who desperately wanted to scratch their entire body but couldn't because they were trying to look devout. To the untrained eye, it looked like a person who had lost an argument with a disgruntled sheep, but to medieval society, a fashion statement of piety. Of course it was. 13. A surprising amount of animal trials. Yes, medieval courts sometimes put animals on trial, and not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Pigs stood trial for murder. Rats were prosecuted for eating grain. Locusts were excommunicated, which presumably left them feeling deeply chastised. Imagine wandering into a courtroom and seeing a solemn judge, a jury trying not to fall asleep, and in the defendant's seat, a mildly bewildered pig. There were lawyers too, real human lawyers defending the animals, with arguments like, well, Your Honor, my client is a pig, and therefore cannot be held morally responsible, because he is a pig. It wasn't the weirdest thing medieval people believed, but it was close, and honestly, it's probably the only time in history when rats were given more legal rights than most peasants. 14. Those medieval doctors with beak masks, who absolutely did not help. We all know the image of the plague doctor, long black coat, wide-brimmed hat, and that spectacularly creepy bird mask. It's iconic, unsettling, and deeply impractical. Now, imagine being a medieval villager who had never seen one. You're sick, feverish, probably hallucinating, and suddenly a tall, bird-faced figure leans over you, comforting. Not especially. Medieval people believed these doctors were elite healers. In reality, most were just moderately literate men with a strong tolerance for unpleasant smells. Their long beaks were filled with herbs intended to filter plague air, which did not work. But it made the doctors smell marginally nicer than the rest of medieval Europe, which, frankly, was an accomplishment. To the villagers, they looked like mysterious, otherworldly beings. To modern viewers, they looked like ravens who moonlight as undertakers. Either way, quite a sight. 15. Medieval relics that were suspicious at best. And finally, drifting into our last odd sight, let's talk about relics. Medieval churches collected holy relics the way modern people collect phone apps, excessively, enthusiastically, and with very little verifying. They claim to have everything from saints' teeth to Jesus' milk, to fragments of the true cross that, if combined, could easily rebuild a wooden cathedral. People traveled for miles to see these sacred objects, approaching with reverence, kneeling, praying, and occasionally donating more money than their families could afford. But even in medieval times, some relics raised eyebrows, like a vial of the Virgin Mary's tears, 3 different heads of John the Baptist, and, at one point, enough authentic baby Jesus foreskins to supply a small drawer in a very strange dresser. Were they real? Almost certainly not. Did it stop people? Of course not. It was medieval Europe. Reality was optional. Let's ease back into the medieval night, where the candles gutter softly, the castle walls creak in the wind, and everyone is just sort of hoping the local baron doesn't get any new ideas. Because when medieval nobles had ideas, they were rarely good ones. In fact, Many of them produced some of the strangest sights Europe ever witnessed. So let's settle in, maybe shift deeper into the blanket, and drift toward another set of peculiar moments. The ones that weren't superstitions or religious oddities, but simply the result of powerful people being wonderfully, spectacularly strange. 16. Kings who bathed so rarely they became attractions. Bathing, in the medieval mindset, was a mixed affair. Some liked it, others feared it. And then there were royals who achieved such consistency in not bathing that people actually wrote about it. Take King Louis XIII of France. He hated baths, despised them, avoided them with the determination of a cat confronted with a puddle. He preferred dry grooming, a sort of royal dust and shake. People at court, who already lived in a world where most smells were robust, found this impressive, in a sad sort of way. But medieval villagers, when they caught a glimpse of him on parade and caught a whiff of the royal atmosphere, it must have been something, a strange, pungent reminder that kings were human too, just very aromatic humans. Bathing was optional, judgment was non-existent, the olfactory experience, unfortunately mandatory. 17. Nobles who carried magical gemstones that did nothing. Medieval elites adored gemstones, not for their sparkle, that was a bonus, but for their magical properties, which were, unfortunately, fabricated by jewel-obsessed monks who really needed a hobby. People believed gems could cure fevers, protect against demons, improve fertility, keep your husband faithful, rarely successful, prevent stabbing, even more rarely successful. So medieval onlookers often saw nobles weighed down with enough gemstones to make a dragon jealous. And the funniest part, if a knight lost a battle, he wasn't upset about the armor. He mourned the gemstones, the magical ones, the ones that were supposed to prevent exactly what had just happened. It must have been quite a sight for anyone watching from the crowd. Grown men, depending on their amethyst mood, rocks to fend off medieval chaos, like early practitioners of poorly calibrated crystal healing. 18. The medieval giant who was only slightly tall. Medieval chroniclers loved exaggeration, loved it. Subtlety was not their calling. So whenever someone slightly taller than average wandered by, scribes erupted with awe. They labeled him a giant, a colossus, a mountain among men, even if he was, in modern terms, maybe some. Villagers would gather to stare at this alleged titan. Children whispered, priests nodded wisely. Someone always claimed to have seen him lift a cow. Of course, most of these giants were just tall farmhands who regretted being noticed. But to medieval eyes, accustomed to widespread malnutrition and extremely low ceilings, yes, 6'1" was indeed a towering miracle. It's one of those moments where you can almost hear medieval Europe collectively saying, "He touched the top shelf, this must be sorcery." 19. The knight who rode into battle in full gold armor. Every now and then, a noble decided to fight a war as if he were attending a fashion show. One such man was Duke Charles the Bold, a name that tells you everything, and yet nothing at all. He loved shiny things. He loved gold even more, and naturally, he commissioned a full suit of gilded armor, so ornate, so impractical, that it was essentially a shimmering medieval disco ball on horseback. Imagine the battlefield, mud, smoke, chaos, and then Charles, glimmering like the world's most confused celestial being. Two medieval villagers watching him ride past. It must have felt like witnessing a very wealthy star descend from the sky, a star that was about to make many deeply poor decisions, because Charles wore the gold armor into real combat. Predictably, it made him an excellent target. Also predictably, it did not end well, but it was, undeniably, one of the more dazzling sights medieval Europe ever produced. 20. The man who claimed he ate nothing except the Eucharist. Medieval Europe hosted many mystics. Some were respected, some were tolerated, a few were politely avoided at dinner tables. And then there were the breatharians of the Middle Ages, people who insisted they survived entirely on Holy Communion wafers. One example was a woman named Lidwina of Sedum, who allegedly consumed only the Eucharist for years. Clergy declared it miraculous. Villagers, meanwhile, quietly wondered whether she was sneaking snacks. To the medieval eye, these miracle fasters were astonishing sights, pale, trembling, often bedridden, radiating a mix of spiritual fervor and severe calorie deficiency. Naturally, the church treated them as holy wonders. Naturally, medieval peasants treated them as slightly suspicious. And naturally, Modern historians read the accounts with the quiet sigh of people who have seen one too many medieval exaggerations. Still, it made for quite a sight, especially in a world where most people lived in constant hunger, and anyone claiming to live on one wafer a day seemed both miraculous and mildly so. Let's ease onward, drifting deeper into the odd little corners of medieval life. The corners most people avoided, unless they were feeling particularly curious or particularly bored. Both common medieval conditions. The torches flicker, a distant dog barks at absolutely nothing, and everyone is quietly hoping they don't get drafted for some noble's sudden ill-planned crusade. So let's wander back into the strangeness. 21. The medieval hermits who lived in wells, trees, and occasionally inside walls. Hermits were everywhere in medieval Europe. Some lived in caves, some lived in forests, and others, well, they got creative. One hermit famously chose to live inside a hollowed-out tree, which must have been a bit drafty but offered excellent squirrel-watching opportunities. Another lived inside a well, a sort of reverse Rapunzel situation, except instead of letting down her hair, she probably just asked visitors if they could kindly lower down a loaf of bread. The strangest, though, were the anchorites, people who volunteered to be sealed inside small cells attached to churches, permanently, with only a tiny window to speak through. Medieval villagers would walk by and hear murmured prayers coming from what was basically a bricked-up human storage compartment. It must have been eerie, a quiet voice floating from inside a wall like, "Good morning. Yes, I'm still in here. No, I cannot leave. Yes, this was voluntary." To us, it sounds absurd. To medieval people, it was Tuesday. 22. Royal coronations that took entire days. Coronations were long, painfully long. Imagine a ceremony so drawn out that it could outlast a modern wedding, 2 holiday dinners, and possibly a tax audit. People who attended medieval coronations often found themselves standing for hours, sometimes in rain, sometimes in cold, sometimes next to someone who definitely had not discovered deodorant, and yet they stayed, because the spectacle was mesmerizing. They saw gold scepters shaped like things no one could identify, velvet robes, weighing as much as a medium-sized goat, bishops blessing every object within arm's reach, a king trying not to look terrified, and nobles constantly adjusting their hats, which always seemed to be slipping for medieval viewers. It was equal parts impressive and tedious, like watching a very slow parade featuring people who were extremely proud of their shoes. It was strange, it was extravagant, and it was one of the few forms of entertainment not involving livestock. 23. The medieval dancing plague, hypnotic, confusing, and very bad for everyone. One of the most bewildering spectacles was the dancing plague of 1518, when people completely against their will danced uncontrollably in the streets of Strasbourg. Imagine villagers waking up, stretching, opening the shutters, and seeing their neighbors dancing with the wild, exhausted energy of someone trapped at a wedding reception after the DJ refuses to let anyone go home. People danced for hours, days, some for a week. They collapsed, got up again, and kept going. Doctors tried diagnosing it, priests tried praying over it, nobles tried ignoring it. None were very successful. Eventually, someone suggested building a dance hall and hiring musicians, because naturally, when people can't stop dancing, more music is the answer. It was one of the strangest events ever witnessed, an entire town accidentally inventing the rave, centuries before electricity. 24. The medieval cult of the Holy Greyhound. Yes, a dog, a very holy dog, named Saint Guinevere. Here's how it happened. A loyal greyhound defended a baby from a snake. The parents misunderstood, thought the dog had attacked the child, killed the dog, discovered the truth, regretted everything, as one does. Villagers, recognizing the dog's heroic spirit and possibly feeling guilty on its behalf, decided he must be a saint. So they began visiting his shrine, really just a patch of woods, to pray for the health of their children. Imagine the sight, people kneeling reverently in front of a tree stump, whispering prayers to a dog who never asked for any of this. The church eventually banned the cult, but medieval villagers, they loved Saint Guinevere. He was dependable, loyal, and had a better track record than many human saints. 25. Medieval windows that weren't actually windows. Glass was expensive, very expensive, so most medieval windows weren't windows. They were thin cloth animal horn slices, oiled paper, or just big holes where wind, insects, and neighbor gossip wandered freely. To medieval people, Seeing real glass was astonishing. It felt like magic, clear, smooth, luxurious magic. Nobles showed off their glass windows the way modern people show off expensive televisions. Visitors would approach, press their nose against the smooth surface, and say things like, "Ah yes, transparency, remarkable," for villagers used to drafty cloth and horn panes that made everything look like a blurry soup. Glass was an event, a revelation, a medieval IMAX, even more amusing. People often removed their glass windows during storms because the glass was too precious to risk. Imagine a noble yelling, "Quick, take the windows out, it's raining." To medieval viewers, it made perfect sense. 26. The cadaver trials, trials held for people who were very much dead in one of the more bizarre chapters of medieval justice. Pope Stephen VI famously put his predecessor, Pope Formosus, on trial. Formosus was dead, quite dead, had been dead for months, and yet Stephen ordered the corpse exhumed, propped on a throne, dressed in papal robes, and interrogated in court. Villagers who somehow witnessed the procession must have been deeply confused. Imagine seeing a rotting pope being carried through the streets like some kind of morbid parade float. In court, the corpse was accused of crimes, questioned, found guilty shockingly, and then thrown into the river. It was one of the strangest, darkest, and most theatrical spectacles medieval people ever saw, and afterward, everyone who witnessed it probably needed a very long nap. Let's settle even deeper into the medieval night. That familiar world where logic was optional. Doctors carried amulets instead of medical knowledge, and everyone had at least one relative who believed soup could cure any illness, including the ones it most certainly caused. The torches burned low, the sky hangs quiet, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster is probably crowing at the wrong hour, because medieval roosters were not known for their professionalism. So let's drift back into the strangeness. 27. Nobles who owned pet lions and regretted it immediately. Royalty loved exotic animals. It made them feel powerful, wealthy, and just a little bit above the rules of nature. So kings and queens collected lions, leopards, bears, and other animals that absolutely should not live in a castle courtyard. Unsurprisingly, medieval people were astonished, partly because they'd never seen a lion, and partly because they were amazed the king was still alive. Crowds gathered whenever the royal menagerie paraded through town. People gasped, children hid, someone always whispered, "Are we sure it's tied up?" The noble, meanwhile, stood proudly beside the cage with the false confidence of someone who had clearly never read a single bestiary. These pet lions often escaped, briefly, chaotically, and often during dinner. A strange sight indeed, nobles pretending everything was under control, peasants fleeing, and the lion thoroughly confused. 28. The knight who showed up in armor so tight he couldn't sit down. Chivalry was glamorous. In theory, in practice, it involved impressive discomfort. One medieval knight, wanting to impress viewers during a tournament, had armor crafted so finely sculpted to his body that he could barely move. He looked magnificent, like a polished statue carved from stubborn metal. The crowd admired him. Then he tried to mount his horse, very slowly, and very unsuccessfully. Squires attempted to lift him. The horse backed away. The knight wobbled like an upright loaf of bread. Medieval spectators, used to odd tournaments, still found this entertaining. They watched respectfully, but also with that subtle medieval expression that said, "Ah yes, another noble with more money than foresight." It was a reminder that fashion, even in medieval times, sometimes required sacrificing personal dignity. 29. The priest who tried to baptize an entire river. Some priests, in their enthusiasm, took religious symbolism to unusual places. One particularly spirited cleric attempted to baptize a river. Yes, an entire river. Villagers watched as he chanted solemnly at the water, sprinkling holy droplets into a body of water that already contained several thousand gallons of non-holy droplets. The logic was that if the river became blessed, then anyone bathing in it would also be blessed, which, you know, isn't the worst idea. In a world where bathing was rare enough to count as a spiritual experience, the villagers who witnessed this must have felt equal parts reverence and confusion, especially when the river immediately washed the holy water downstream, like a mildly annoyed participant. Still, it was a sight, one man trying to purify nature with a cup of water and an earnest expression. 30. Medieval bloodletting festivals. Yes, this was a thing. Bloodletting was considered an all-purpose cure. bad mood, bloodletting, headache, bloodletting, your spouse is irritating you. Well, the physician could handle that too. Some towns held what were essentially casual bloodletting days. Everyone lined up, sleeves rolled, waiting for the local barber surgeon to remove just enough blood to balance the humors, which were always conveniently unbalanced. To an outsider, it must have looked like a very orderly panic. People voluntarily letting themselves be poked with knives in the hopes of feeling less awful than they already did. Sometimes entire families participated, turning it into a bonding event. Medieval quality time, you could say. The barber surgeon would finish, wipe his blade on something questionably clean, and move to the next patient, who tried very hard not to faint in front of their neighbors. A strange spectacle, half medical, half social, entirely medieval. 31. Royal feasts where the food was alive. Medieval banquets were dramatic, very dramatic, possibly to distract from the fact that food poisoning was always lurking nearby. One popular entertainment was serving pies that contained live birds. Yes, you'd cut into the crust, and a flock of confused sparrows would fly out, flapping around the hall while nobles clapped politely and peasants wondered whether this counted as dinner. Another favorite was the entremet centerpieces shaped like castles, ships, or mythical beasts. Some even moved, some even breathed fire, thanks to tubes of burning alcohol that absolutely should not have been anywhere near cloth tapestries. Imagine a medieval villager seeing this for the first time. A giant pastry dragon breathing flames, while a noble calmly dips bread into gravy like this is entirely normal. It was culinary theater at its finest, and occasionally its most dangerous. 32. The medieval vegetable lamb that people thought was real for centuries. Europeans believed in a plant called the vegetable lamb of Tartary, a mythical shrub that grew tiny woolly lambs as fruit. Perfectly normal. Nothing to question. Travelers returned with stories of fields of lamb plants swaying softly in the wind, each connected to the soil by an umbilical stem. People believed it. Artists painted it. Scholars debated it. Some villagers swore they had seen it with their own eyes, which was generous, considering it did not exist. Yet, medieval people regularly witnessed their neighbors earnestly describing lamb plants like they were discussing a particularly nice cabbage variety. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. To medieval minds, it was simply one of nature's fun surprises, like oversized turnips, or nobles who lived past 40. 33. Nobles who traveled with portable thrones. Being royal required constant sitting, sitting dramatically, sitting with dignity, sitting above everyone else. So nobles often traveled with portable thrones, insanely heavy, ornate chairs that servants carried ahead of them. Imagine being a medieval peasant, watching a group of men hauling an oversized golden chair through a muddy road, panting miserably, while the noble followed behind, walking at a leisurely pace. When the group arrived somewhere, the servants immediately set the throne down, dusted it, fluffed it, bowed, and then allowed the noble to sit for exactly 10 minutes before continuing the journey. To medieval onlookers, it was an impressive but bewildering performance. A reminder that social hierarchy was, above all, exhausting for the people carrying furniture. 34. The doctor who prescribed wearing red as a medical treatment. Medieval medicine was imaginative. One physician recommended wearing bright red during illness to draw out fevers, not metaphorically, literally. The red color was supposed to intimidate the disease into retreating, so villagers would sometimes see the sick wrapped in scarlet sheets, looking like medieval burritos of vaguely medical intention. People whispered things like, "Ah, yes, he's wearing the red." Very powerful method. Whether it worked, not really, but it made the streets more colorful, in a slightly concerning way. It also led to the strange sight of multiple patients gathered together, all dressed in dramatic crimson, resembling a group of exhausted holiday decorations. 35. The traveling tooth puller who worked in the middle of market squares. Medieval dentistry was not gentle. Traveling tooth pullers, self-proclaimed experts, who were sometimes just very enthusiastic, would set up in town squares and yank teeth out in front of gathered crowds. Musicians often accompanied the performance, not to soothe the patient, but to drown out the screaming. People treated it like entertainment. Children watched. Vendors sold snacks. Someone usually fainted, and afterward, the newly toothless patient received a polite round of applause, because bravery deserved recognition, especially when performed publicly with no anesthesia. A sight that combined medicine, theater, and mild trauma. Very medieval, very memorable. Hey everyone, settle back in. If you've made it this far, you're already in that cozy, half-floating state where the medieval world starts to feel almost normal. Almost. But of course, we still have a few more peculiarities to wander through before the candle burns low. So let's drift gently into the nighttime habits of medieval people. Habits that ranged from mildly eccentric to someone should probably check on them, though, naturally, no one ever did. Medieval sleep was, in itself, a bit strange. They had what historians like to call the first sleep and second sleep. People would go to bed after dark, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night to wander around, pray, think deep thoughts, or more commonly complain about the cold. Then they'd drift into a second sleep until sunrise. It was basically biphasic sleep with an extra layer of existential dread. Now, imagine layering this sleep pattern on top of medieval mysticism. What you get is a whole genre of people who were absolutely convinced that wandering half-conscious through the house, or the field, or the monastery cloister meant they were on some kind of divine mission. Take Saint Christina the Astonishing, a woman who, by the reports of her contemporaries, spent half her nights levitating, convulsing, or hiding in rafters because the scent of sinful humanity allegedly offended her. Imagine being her medieval roommate. You wake up for your scheduled first sleep intermission, stretch, maybe say a quiet prayer, and glance up to see Christina perched on a ceiling beam like a medieval bat, staring down in silent judgment. Very calming, very bedtime friendly. People wrote about her with absolute sincerity. To them, this was a blessed sign. To us, it reads more like the testimony of someone who hadn't slept properly since 1182. The monastery monks continued trying to interpret her behavior through the lens of holiness, because naturally, once the phrase divine miracle starts floating around, no one wants to be the first to say, "Are we sure she's not just tired?" And so, her sleepwalking, nocturnal climbing, and dramatic fainting episodes went down in history as spiritual ecstasy, rather than, perhaps, a very profound need for rest and a qualified physician. But Christina wasn't the only nighttime wanderer. Medieval people regularly reported seeing processions of the dead traveling through fields at night. These were described as long ghostly lines, gently marching, muttering, clanging, or calling out. The accounts are eerie, but they make a bit more sense when you remember that night was actually pitch black back then. No streetlights, no glowing windows, just darkness thick enough to hide an army. So if you saw a group of tired pilgrims stumbling home, or monks walking with lanterns, or even just your neighbor's cows deciding to go on a midnight stroll, your brain already fogged with interrupted sleep would fill in the rest. One famous case comes from Orderic Vitalis, who described seeing an enormous hellish parade of souls marching across a field one night. He insisted he saw knights, peasants, monks, women, children, all moving silently in procession. Historians today like to note that Orderic was known to be extremely exhausted and highly impressionable. But sure, why not? Ghost parade. Because of course he saw that medieval villagers took these sightings very seriously. If you confessed to seeing such a procession, it wasn't treated as a hallucination, it was usually treated as a warning from the divine, or a sign that you needed to donate more money to the church. Convenient, really. Now, while we're wandering through this twilight space, let's drift over to something else medieval people found strange and deeply meaningful: sleep talking. Today, if someone mumbles nonsense in their sleep, we shrug and maybe record it for laughs. But in the medieval era, sleep talk was taken as a form of involuntary prophecy. People believed that the boundary between earthly life and spiritual realms grew thinner during sleep. So whatever escaped your mouth at 2 a.m. was treated with a reverence it did not deserve. Imagine a medieval nobleman bolting upright in the night, shouting something like, the geese are stealing my boots." By morning, 3 scribes are in his room taking dictation, and a nervous monk is drawing allegorical geese in the margins of his manuscript. It became a genuine problem for royal courts, because kings, famously, had a lot of dreams. They also had a lot of anxiety. Combine those, and you end up with royal advisors taking strategic advice from whatever half-coherent dream fragment their monarch happens to blurt out. One king reportedly woke shouting about a giant fish swallowing another fish, which his advisors interpreted as a sign to raise taxes. Because naturally, everything meant raising taxes. Another nighttime issue medieval people found profoundly unsettling was nightmares which they didn't see as subconscious stress at all. They believed nightmares were caused by demons sitting on your chest while you slept. The word nightmare actually comes from the Old English mere, a malicious spirit that visited you at night. So if someone woke up gasping and panicked, their family didn't ask if they were stressed or dehydrated. They assumed the demon had simply been a bit heavier than usual. Sometimes they'd blame cats, because cats sit on sleeping humans all the time. And to be fair, that one might have had a basis in reality, but mostly they blamed spirits. One monk recorded waking up to a crushing demon intent on silencing my breath. Given that he was extremely overweight, slept on his back, and lived in a monastery that served a steady diet of bread, cheese, and beer, we have our suspicions. But the medieval explanation was, yes, demons, again. Let's drift even further into the night, where things get stranger still. Medieval people believed that sleep was a moment when your soul partially left your body, not fully just enough to float around a little. So if someone shook you awake too suddenly, there was a risk your soul might not have time to get back in. This made waking someone up a delicate operation. You didn't throw cold water or tap them on the shoulder. Instead, you quietly whispered their name several times until they stirred. It's unclear whether this method actually worked, but it was very polite, except for the inevitable moment when you had to explain why you were standing over someone whispering in the dark, like a medieval ghost yourself. And if someone died unexpectedly in their sleep, people described it as the soul simply forgetting to return, which, based on average medieval sleep quality, seems somewhat plausible. Now, one of the strangest things medieval people believed about nighttime involved the moon. They were absolutely convinced it controlled madness, and to be fair, the word lunatic literally comes from luna, the moon. People kept careful track of lunar phases so they would know when their neighbors were most likely to act strange. As if medieval life didn't already provide plenty of reasons for everyone to act strange all the time. Doctors believed moonlight could affect bodily fluids, specifically the infamous humors. Too much moon exposure, they said, could increase phlegmatic imbalance, which sounds unpleasant but was probably just early seasonal depression. And if someone behaved oddly during a full moon, no one was surprised. It was simply the moon doing its monthly shift as assistant manager of human behavior. And of course, we can't leave nighttime oddities without mentioning comets, because medieval people did not handle comets well. A comet, to them, was essentially God's way of waving a big cosmic sign that said, something terrible is about to happen, probably to you. Sorry about that. Every time one appeared, kings panicked, nobles panicked, peasants panicked in a more resigned, oh look, another disaster sort of way. Chroniclers scrambled to record the exact shape of the comet's tail, as if the length or angle might reveal whether the coming catastrophe would involve famine, plague, or simply another disappointing royal heir. When Halley's comet appeared in 1066, people described it as a blazing omen the size of a dragon's soul, which is poetic in a very medieval way. Today, we know comets are mostly ice and dust. Back then, there were cosmic emails from the divine always marked urgent and never containing good news, but will drift from the heavens back down to earth for the next part, because medieval people didn't save their strangest interpretations just for nighttime. They saved a few for the daylight too.